such a way as a fellow traveler who knew HMS Richards. Did you ever hear him in person?
No.
Oh, you didn't get to? Okay. Yeah, he was, yeah. Well, in his later years, he spoke at SoCal camp meeting in Northern California, one of the 3 largest camp meetings in America, at least it has been. And they helped him a lot. You know, I think that it was a rainy day, so they took, as I remember, he had a long coat that they took care of. You know that HMS Richards was essentially blind. And he is just so distinctive and just such a powerful personage in Adventist history. Oh. Well, anyway, that's giving you some idea of where I'm starting to head here, because when we talk about history and learning the lessons from history, there is one place in history that the Bible writers emphasize over and over, endlessly. And I can summarize it in one word. How's that? You could do a whole series with this one word. You could spend a year with this one word in church services. And the one word is Exodus. When you look at the concepts in the Exodus and God's people moving from Egypt to Canaan, you find the template for all of what takes place in this earth's history, especially as we come into the closing days. And you know, this isn't just something that I made up, you know, in the still of the night and thinking about things. Taylor Bunch, one of our most prominent Adventist ministers ever, Taylor Bunch was so impressed with the Exodus that he developed a series of presentations called the Exodus in Type and Annotype. You can still get it. It is powerful. And he gave it at the Battle Creek Church in the 1930s. And what we call the Battle Creek Tabernacle. And in there you get such exquisite insights. Just incredible on the teachings of the Exodus for us. Because we're supposed to be going from Egypt to Canaan. Unfortunately, sometimes, as Ellen White wrote in Volume 5, the church is retreating steadily toward Egypt. Sometimes we get into that problem. But we have these incredible experiences just waiting to unfold for us as we remember the stones of remembrance. And everybody that comes in has to have one of these. So I'm going to give you one of these. This is kind of the opening salvo for the study of Joshua. Let's just go down a couple more paragraphs. This is about third from the end. Look at this. Christian history is littered with religious bodies who have forgotten where they came from. Littered with them. Now, just this week, there was a report on a famous network, and I think it was produced this week, very recent, in which people are noting, and they interviewed a famous, probably a very well-known, I would imagine, professor, and when you look at the trends, organized religion, the big religious bodies, the large denominations in this country are losing members so fast that they're headed for extinction. Now, it isn't that all religion is lost in America. It's that religion has taken a different shape. And so we no longer belong to mainline denominations as our allegiance, but we're more, in a sense, independent. And or we get into charismatic or evangelical contemporary Christianity. And so this whole idea of people losing their identity is critical to the Adventist mind. Because Because if we lose our identity, I'll never forget, years ago, we had a guy come and speak for one of our ministers' conventions. I wasn't at this one, but it was written up in Ministry Magazine. And he said, you Adventists, he says, look at this, and this you're doing. It's terrific. He said, but if you lose your identity, you're in big trouble. Big trouble. And you know what I see today is there are some Adventist magazines that are hell-bent. Not official magazines, not conference magazines, but independent magazines that are supposedly thoughtful and provocative and insightful. But they're all object, it seems to me, even though they have some good articles at times, is to degrade and demote and literally destroy the uniqueness of Adventism. I think the most famous one that strikes my mind now, there's two prominent ones, Spectrum and Adventist Today. The one I'm thinking about mostly right now is Adventist Today. And I actually had an opportunity to write for them, and I'm still, I still might do it because, they give me a chance if they'd ever print it to say some things that I think people who read that need to hear. But I'm very frightened at our obsession with losing our identity. Just, I don't know what it is. We just want to be like the others so badly that we lose our focus. And I think part of it's because it's a reaction against the legalism that was especially those of us, that we can remember, from the mid-20th century and forward, although it started before then. And so in a reaction to that, we just want to be grace-centered, so we say. But it isn't biblical grace, because biblical grace leads to obedience by faith. And we want the cheap grace. Just kind of leave me where I'm at, thank you. I'll just rejoice in all the promises. Yeah. And so, in our fear of legalism, we have become a non-entity at times. And like I say, and I just say this over, I'm not afraid of my identity in Christ as a Seventh-day Adventist who believes that I'm simply exploring the mind of Christ more as I read about what he's doing for me today. That's why I'm a Seventh-day Adventist.
I think that relates to the parable of the 10 virgins. In the book Christ's Object Lesson,
Yeah.
it says the distinction between the 5 wise virgins and the 5 foolish was that the 5 wise ones were not satisfied with a superficial experience. So unfortunately, that's telling us that a big segment of our church are satisfied with a superficial experience.
That's right.
And if that's what you have, that's not much to be proud of. I mean, it's not much to want to recount what's been happening.
Exactly. And you know what else on that? Is it's also creates the breeding ground for this question. And we're getting this way too much. Why am I a Seventh-day Adventist anyway? And then a second question that relates to that is, who really cares what church anybody's in? So let's just all be happy and we'll all be like little rivulets heading to the stream that ends in glory. And if that's true, then we really haven't got a mission, because everybody else is doing it too. And we can just add our little 2 cents for it. But we believe that we have a message that truly reductionistic arguments, but in the exhilaration of knowing how much work heaven has gone to save our souls. And that just is incredible as far as I'm concerned. Now, I said Joanne I'd give everybody we've been discussing this. I won't repeat it, but this has to do with, I'll give you two of them. If you see somebody, give them one. This whole idea of these stones of remembrance, and not forgetting who we are, but not being proud either. The other way is this. We come up to people kind of like, we know what's going to happen. You don't. We know who Antichrist is. You're confused. And if we even subtly carry that attitude, unaware of it ourselves, people will be turned away from our religion because they sense that spiritual arrogance. And somehow we have to convey by the Lord's amazing grace the fact that I am a sinner being saved by God's amazing grace. And when we come at anything we share with that appreciative attitude, then it is that people are disarmed and open to what we call the truth, present truth of this last day. So, it is a delicate balancing act. I want to go over to Sunday, and we're going to, one way or another, get through everything. And again, that clock is about 20 minutes past. It must be a very energetic clock that we have. 20 minutes fast. Can you believe that? We never used to have that problem. But it's been turbocharged. Maybe it's a spiritual lesson for us that time is running out faster than we thought. Okay. On Sunday, I want to just mention something here. I think we're going to take a Bible text, though, to mention it. And that's Hebrews 11, verse 30. And I'm not going to give you any other clues than that. Hebrews 11, verse 30. And if you have it, read it out loud in your loudest voice. Hebrews 11, verse 30. I'll get another one of these microphones. So we have microphones everywhere. Hebrews 11, verse 30. Anybody can read.
By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people marched around them for 7 days.
Now, that sounds simple enough. By faith, the walls of, I'm going to give you one back here so you can kind of share it around. By faith, the walls of Jericho came down. I've read that for years, but since dipping into this study, it just took on new meaning. Because, and I'll tell you why, because faith is often diametrically different from human reason. And I'll show you how. Faith isn't blind stupidity, but it's living on a plane that's higher than we have found before. Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. Okay. So, when you look at Ellen White's description of the fall of Jericho, you're struck by I'm going to coin a word, presentness of the situation. In other words, it's like she's sitting in a special cubicle that's all glass, and she can see everything happening. She writes about it in first person. And she says, they would get up there and they'd walk around the city with this very ostentatious march, and then they would go home. Now, especially in a super superstitious culture. The watchmen on the walls were getting spooked. This is weird stuff. They're not attacking us. They're just going through some ritual. And I don't know what it means, one guy says to the other, but it just doesn't look good. So they do this for 6 days. And I'm going to stop here before we get to the 7th day. We always think, yep, Joshua said do this, everybody smiled sweetly and just did it. But think about it, what it took to do something so stupid. You're supposed to take this city, so you're going to march around, give them a concert every day?
Not even that. They were silent.
Yeah.
Except for the tread of their feet.
The tread of their feet. Now, eventually, the concert did show up, but it was a pretty dramatic one. Anyway, so when you look at that, and you go back, as Ellen White did, looking at everything, she said, you know, the people could have easily said, this is meaningless. Why are we doing this? And they didn't have to do what Joshua told them. They had free will, but they chose to believe at that juncture. And as they believed, and they went around, and I don't know, did they play their trumpets a little bit each day?
It was silent.
Was it totally silent on the other days? So the real big one was for the 7th day, right? And by the time they got around there the 7th time, the guys up on the balcony overlooking the city were pretty sure that these people were up to no good. And when those trumpets sounded, you know, the walls came down not just boom in some magical flash. They came down by the order of God through what you would probably think of as a building coming down in an earthquake. And so it started toppling, and then all the bricks or whatever they used come apart, or stones, and then the whole thing just collapses. And it just completely terrified the people. And so when Israel went in, they were meeting people who were already so terrified they couldn't do anything. But now I want to go back to Hebrews' statement. This all happened by, what did you say? Faith. So then the question comes, do we have Jerichos today? Yes, we do. The Adventist church is facing Jerichos everywhere. In terms of our world mission, especially in some parts of the world, in terms of economic challenges, in terms of persecution, in terms of lack of opportunity, and here's the big one in Western Europe and America and Australia and most first world countries, in terms of that most powerful form of all, indifference. And I don't know if you've been to Europe, but you know, everybody is indifferent. We say Western Europe is a secular society. People go over there to see the churches because they're so lofty and beautiful and dramatic. But don't kid yourself. It's not because anybody's in them. The churches are largely empty. They just give us stately reminders of history. And that is interesting. But it isn't because religion's alive and well. So you start thinking of these things and you realize that we need the faith of Joshua, right? Now, I'm moving through several concepts in these lessons. I want you to tell me, after the Jericho success, who did they decide to attack?
Ai.
Ai. And And I've heard it pronounced different ways. I'll stick with AI because I like that. That's how I grew up. But they were pretty confident after that great victory. And so they decided that instead of sending 30,000 troops, how many did they send? 3,000. 3,000. This is going to be a piece of cake. These people are wimps. They're small. Wasn't that big a city. So they come marching up there, proud as peacocks, and suddenly they met an enemy that was far more prepared than they thought. Has the church in this day ever met an enemy that's more well prepared than we thought? Yes, we have. We've met an enemy of heresy in 1979 when Desmond Ford stood in front of the forum at one of our large colleges and said that everything we believe about the investigative judgment is bunk. And if there's anything to learn from 1844, it's simply a repeat and a recital of what Jesus did 2,000 years ago. It's reminding us of that. That's the importance. And the professor, who was one of my professors when I was in college, years before, the professor that was nominated to get up and rebut his argument, because it was supposed to be a forum where you reasonably discuss things, he got up and he said, well, gentlemen and ladies, that was a good speech. See ya. Sat down. That was his rebuttal, essentially. And when we face things like that, how do we do? Well, I'll tell you how we did. Many of us collapsed like the walls of Jericho. It wasn't Des Ford. It was the people who heard it, who should have been marching around Jericho in faith that the walls would come tumbling down. So for a while, you could get Spirit of Prophecy books cheap, because Adventists were selling out their Ellen G. White books left and right, and Adventist ministers, as well as lay people, were leaving the church in droves. All of which to say, we didn't have the faith to begin with. Because if we'd been personally grounded, just like you mentioned at the very beginning, this whole idea of not being superficial. If we'd have been grounded, Des Ford's talk should have gone like this. Da-dun, 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 strong rebuttal, collapse. Instead, it went da-dun, 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 and created the largest upheaval in the church since probably 1907, in that era when John Harvey Kellogg left the church. Unbelievable. And then I think of the Spirit of Prophecy statement that says, if all other means fail, to wake our people up. You know what the Lord's going to bring in? I don't say it, because 9.5 out of 10 of you will say persecution. But it isn't. That isn't what Ellen White says. She says, when all other means fail, that which will awaken the church is, are you ready for this? Heresy. Heresy. Can you believe it? And that's what the Ford controversy brought out. We're not grounded. We thought we knew the 2,300 days. I was pretty sure I did. I was teaching it. But Ford weaseled in on some weak spots we had that we just glossed over. And out of it all came an even deeper, richer, more powerful, and authentic belief in the investigative judgment teaching. But it was a rough sled to do it. You know, I've said this before here, and some of you probably heard it, but you know, I was right in the middle of it. And I was teaching at a school where a church that was a constituent of the school I taught at, the whole church voted to leave the Adventist denomination for church service on a morning just like this. And they all walked up to the front, and a friend of mine, unfortunately had been beguiled, he presided, and they all signed their names and closed the book, walked out as a congregation, shut the door, and left the Adventist church. And that's the setting of when I started teaching that fall. And I had students who were part of that or knew it real well. One neat thing about young people is they had been advised not to go to an Adventist school because they would be persecuted. So thankfully, some of them talked their parents into letting them come anyway, so they were in my Bible class. And what's interesting is, by the time it was all, as we studied, the students, I could sit there like this and listen to my own students rebut Ford's heresy. And the other students who'd been beguiled and said, yeah, we're just a bunch of bunk because we believe in this 1844 stuff. And my students, I could just sit back and watch them beautifully explain the truths that we as Seventh-day Adventists hold so dear. What an experience. And so, you know, when you read these old stories of the walls coming down and all these things, you know, you've got to think, how does it apply today? For example, do you see Joshua as a prophet? I do. Because he said, if you do this, this will happen. Cause effect. If you act in faith, Jesus will rescue you from those bad guys. And so today, you know, we have the same challenge to induce people to exercise faith that's once delivered to the saints. Real faith, biblical faith, not just mamby-pamby or even legalistic faith, so-called faith. You know, I'm going to give you just an example of how this played out. Not everybody in Jericho, even though the walls came tumbling down, I always feel like when we're on this topic, I bring my horn and play Joshua fight the Battle of Jericho. But not everybody died that day. There were actually some citizens in Jericho that made it through. Do you know who they were? You should. Rahab. And what? And her family. That's because her home had become an ark of safety. A very dear friend of mine, a principal, I believe he was visiting a family one summer recruiting for an Adventist school. And while he was upstairs talking to mommy and daddy, the kids were downstairs watching the most horrendous hit movie stuff, degenerate rock and roll music and everything. And it really struck my friend. Now here we're inviting these students and trying to talk mom and dad into encouraging them to come to an Adventist school. But what's happening right within the home? Instead of an ark of safety, it's become a beacon of terror to these kids' religious life. So I'm really big on the kind of home nurture that our children get. I mean big. If you don't have, look, we face this all the time as educators. You know, I started teaching 60 years ago now. But, you know, everybody wants a school to fix everything. So, you know, they send their kids to an Adventist school, and then they say, we just can't figure out why they just didn't turn out at all. We spent all this money for Adventist education, but if you get to the bottom of it, the fact is that every mom and dad has the sacred obligation to create an ark of safety in their home. Now, ark of safety is not an ark of abruptness or, trying to overlord the kids. It's one where pleasantness and collegiality reigns, but but where Jesus is lifted up and God is honored systematically through worship and just the general tenor of the home. You know, I don't know what to say about this, but I had a Pentecostal preacher friend one time when I was pastoring in Michigan. And for some reason, I can't remember what it was. He bought something from me or something, and he came over to my house. And when he came there, he said, I can just sense that the Lord is in this house. Wow. I never even thought of it like that. And I wonder, are we that serious about our children? You know, I was at the DMV the other day, and I was so struck. I said I'd never waste my money to get a special license plate. But they had some of those license plates that were dirt cheap. And then they had all the ones that were more money. And one of the dirt cheap, really colorful license plates says on the bottom of it, education begins at home. I was so struck with that when I came back to get a license on something, I ordered it. And I can hardly wait because it'll be my quiet testimony. It isn't in your face. People say, well, now, what are we saying? But it opens up doors to talk about a lot of things. And look, it isn't prayer in public school that we need. We need prayer at home. Now, we're counseled to be wise as serpents and not make a big stink about prayer in public schools. But the fact is, that which will change the tenor of America is prayer at home. At home. Well, I want to just zero in on one other thing here, a thing or two. Why do you think, and I want you to think about this, why was he so rough on people in Joshua, Judges, and some of these early Old Testament books? How come they got beat up so bad under the direction of God's direct leadership? And what kind of God is it that would destroy whole people groups and whole cities? And you know, I find even in Adventism, there's not real clear understandings of this. And how really to relate the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New. I mean, I had a colleague, and I think his dad was a pastor. And when I was teaching at his school, and he always wanted to teach Bible. He was a music teacher, but he just wanted to have a Bible class. So they gave him, I think it was freshman Bible, and it was Old Testament history. And you know what? My friend had a hard time with his faith after jumping into Old Testament history. He couldn't reconcile the God of the Old Testament with the New. He's a very thoughtful person. Went on to get a doctorate in some area of music and teach music at one of our universities for many years. A dear man, good man. So, how do you explain that God does all these horrible things to little boys and girls, as well as mommies and dads? How do you explain that? Do you have an answer you'd like to share with us? There isn't just one answer. Have you ever wrestled with this or met people who are wrestling with this? What would you say? Yeah.
One of the things that's common in wrestling with problems in the Bible is that we often don't read the whole story or the whole context or the whole book or whatever it is. When we look at the Canaanites, God's interaction with the Canaanites did not start with Joshua. It started way back in the time of Abraham.
exactly it.
And
Exactly
then,
it.
and then Joseph.
Yep.
Joseph ends up in Egypt and becomes a savior of all the Canaanites
Yep.
in the time of famine. So God was appealing to them over and over and over again that their gods were nothing and the God of Abraham was everything.
That's right. That was a beautiful summary of the history. Let me just add this in the few minutes that we have. That was great. It isn't that all of a sudden the Israelites show up and beat the socks off everybody. It's that they had so many warnings that they purposely rejected that their children in each generation, because God bore with them for hundreds of years, their children became worse than mommy and daddy. And then their children's children were worse than their parents. Until, here's something. There's an interesting description in the book Desire of Ages, which applies to this just as much. If Jesus hadn't come, she says, when he did, now we're getting into the 1st century AD, more or less. If he hadn't have come, humanity would have destroyed itself. It would have gone extinct. Because the nature of sin is to destroy life. And Satan had chained so many people to his cars of lust and degradation that the entire planet was in danger of extinction. Because that's the natural result of sin. You see, the reason we sit back and wonder why God was so harsh and get all upset about it is because we do not even faintly, I include myself, understand the horror, the cancer of sin, and how destructive sin is. We don't get it. And God says, if I hadn't have walked in here with the Israelites, these people would have destroyed every vestige of the knowledge of God on this planet. And in mercy, God had to take out whole people. But remember this, even though that happened, any individual could say, yes, Lord. Now here's a prostitute. Do you think that all her family members understood the 2,300 days and everything? I doubt it. I don't think they knew much about Jehovah God, but they made a decision that in their darkness, they wanted something better. And because of that veiled, limited, myopic decision, God spared everybody who came into Rahab's house. Right? You think about the ramifications of that. So how do we relate to people? We should see every person as a candidate for the kingdom of God. And leave it to the Lord to sift, who's who. Exactly. I mean, we just have tremendous opportunities. And then I want to add one other thing, and I think it was Paul Huback, the great Adventist theologian of yesteryear, who probably none of you have ever heard of, but he taught at Walla Walla, what's now Walla Walla University, for I think a number of years. But I think it was Paul Huback's research that opened up something to me many, many years ago. And that is, he discovered what you learned this week. He discovered back in the 1950s, I think. And that is that based on the fragments that we have and on the archaeological evidence that we have discovered, the Canaanites were so perverse that it would defy imagination. The things that they did, they believed that everything that benefited them, the rain, the sun, everything, was all dependent on the sex of sexual behavior of their gods. And in order to encourage their gods, of course, they would engage in the same kind of behaviors. That's why they had sexual perversion as part of the worship. Now we're living in a day and age when sexual perversion has become the norm. But now I'm going to quit preaching and go to meddling. If you read the chapter of Patriarchs and Prophets called Apostasy at the Jordan, which is when Israel should have crossed in, but they didn't because of the sin of what? Baal Peor. And what was that sin? They were invited to a Miss Moab contest.